The letter arrived on a Tuesday in a certified envelope. Marcus Webb signed for it at the end of his driveway, and by the time he got back to the house, he'd already guessed what was inside. The previous landowner had sold his portfolio the prior fall, 1,100 acres of cash rent ground that Marcus had been farming for 11 years. He knew the new company was going through the leases. He knew they were restructuring. What he didn't know was the number. He sat down at his kitchen table, pulled out the letter, and read it twice. New proposed rental rate, $399 per acre. His current rate, $285, a 40% increase. He set the letter down on the table and stared at it. Then he picked up his calculator. He thought the planter was the problem. It wasn't. Let's do the math first, because that's where this story lives. At $285 an acre, Marcus was paying $313,500 a year for his rented ground. At $3,999, that number jumped to $438,900. The difference, $125,400 per year. More than $10,000 a month in additional fixed cost applied overnight before a single seed went in the ground. His corn margin in an average year ran $60 to $75 per acre. Some years better, some worse. On 1,100 acres, that put his gross margin at roughly $66,000 to $82,000 in a reasonable year. You can already see the problem. The increase alone wiped out more than a year's worth of corn margin on his entire operation. He'd be farming at a loss before he finished paying for inputs. Marcus pulled out his operating spreadsheet. He'd built it over years, updating it every January. He went line by line. Seed, fertilizer, chemical, fuel, labor, equipment depreciation, cash rent. Then he typed in $390 and hit enter. The bottom line turned red. Not slightly red, deep red. He pushed back from the table. Outside, his 12-row planter sat in the equipment shed. He'd bought it 5 years ago to replace an older 8-row he'd been running since he started. The upgrade made sense at the time. More acres per day, better placement, precision technology. He financed it over 7 years. Annual payment, $82,000. He had 2 years left on the note. 2 more payments of $82,000 before it was his. It was the biggest single line item in his cost structure outside of cash rent. He thought about that number for a long time. Here's something most people outside of agriculture don't understand about farming at scale. Your margin is thin, your costs are fixed, and your income is variable. Corn prices move, yields move, but your equipment note doesn't move, your lease doesn't move, your bank covenant doesn't move. What that means in practice is that when one fixed cost rises sharply, the whole structure shifts. You don't have room to absorb a 40% rent increase the way a business with fat margins might. Farming isn't that business. Marcus was working with a $750,000 operating line of credit from his regional agricultural lender. That line renewed every fall after harvest. For the renewal to go through, he had to meet his bank's DSCR requirement, debt service coverage ratio. The DSCR is a simple concept. It measures whether your income is enough to cover your debt payments. The bank wanted his ratio at 1:15 or better, meaning for every dollar of debt service, he needed to show $1.15 in income. If his cash flows didn't support that number, the line didn't renew. And without the operating line, he couldn't buy seed or fertilizer. Without seed and fertilizer, he couldn't plant a crop. It was that direct. With the rent at $319 and corn margins where they were, Marcus ran the DSCR calculation 3 times. Same result every time. He came up short. The bank would flag it. The operating line would be in jeopardy. He had until January to respond to the lease proposal. He almost signed it anyway. That was the first near-defeat moment. There's a logic to it. If he walked away from the ground, he lost the operation entirely. He'd built 11 years of production history on that land. He had relationships with the elevator, the co-op, the neighbors. Losing 100 acres wasn't just losing income, it was potentially ending the farm. What was $125,000 a year against that? Maybe he could cut somewhere else. Maybe corn prices would run up. Maybe he could make it work for 1 year and renegotiate the next. His pen hovered over the signature line for longer than he'd like to admit. He put the pen down. He didn't sign. Instead, he called his accountant. The accountant's name was Rita, and she'd been doing books for farm operations in the area for 22 years. She didn't panic when Marcus walked her through the numbers. She'd seen worse. What she told him was precise and not encouraging. At $399 an acre, his operating margins were negative in an average year. To stay above water, he'd need corn to hit prices in the top quartile of recent history and yields above his 5-year average simultaneously. That's not planning. That's gambling. She told him he had 3 options: negotiate the lease down, cut a major fixed cost, or reduce acres. Marcus drove home and sat in front of his equipment shed. The 12-row planter was parked in there, quiet in the November dark. He thought about the remaining note. 2 payments left, $164,000 to go. If he sold it, he could probably clear $90,000 to $95,000 net after the remaining payoff. There was still equity in it, and used planter values had been decent. That would be real cash. It wouldn't solve the rent problem, but it would give him runway. It would reduce his annual fixed costs by $82,000. Maybe that was enough to stay above the DSCR threshold while he figured out the rest. He called the equipment dealer the next morning, told him he was thinking about listing the planter. The dealer asked a few questions about condition, hours, row count, said he could probably move it by spring. Marcus said he'd think about it and call back. He thought the planter was the problem. It wasn't. Let's pause on the math here because this is where a lot of farmers get confused about fixed costs. The planter payment was $82,000 a year. That sounds like a lot, and it is. But here's what selling the planter actually solves and what it doesn't. If Marcus sold the planter, he eliminated the $82,000 annual payment. On paper, that looks like it restores his margin, but he still needs to plant 100 acres. Without a planter, he either rents one, hires custom work, or buys something else. Custom planting at that scale typically runs $15 to $20 an acre. At 100 acres, that's $1,600 to $22,000. His fertilizer timing gets dictated by someone else's schedule. His flexibility disappears. And the rent increase is still there. He'd trade one fixed cost for a smaller variable cost, but the fundamental problem, $125,400 in new annual rent, hadn't moved. Selling the planter was a false solution. It felt like action. It didn't solve the underlying equation. Marcus called the dealer back and told him to hold off. Then he got a call from the new landowner's corporate office. The company that had purchased the land portfolio was a real estate investment firm with agricultural assets across 3 states. Their portfolio manager, a man Marcus had spoken to exactly once since the ownership transfer, called to follow up on the lease proposal. He explained that the previous owner had been charging below market rates on several properties. The $285 figure was roughly 20% under the county average based on their valuation model. The $399 number was calibrated to current market comps. It wasn't personal, it was portfolio restructuring. Marcus listened. He asked if there was any flexibility. The portfolio manager paused and said there might be room to adjust. He offered $356 per acre, a 25% increase instead of 40%. He called it a good faith compromise. He said it reflected Marcus's history on the ground and his record of payments. Take it, and the leases would roll over for 3 years with an annual escalator of 2%. Marcus thanked him, said he'd review it, and got off the phone. He grabbed a notepad. At $356,600, the new annual cost was $391,600. That was $78,100 more than his current rent. Better than $125,400, but it still punched a hole in his margins. He ran the DSCR again at 356 and average corn prices. He came in at 1. Oh, wait. The bank wanted 115, still short. Not as short, but short. He stared at the number. He almost took the 25% offer. That was the second near-defeat moment. It was better. It was survivable, maybe, in a good year. The banker might give him some credit for demonstrating he'd negotiated. Maybe the DSCR threshold had a little flexibility. Maybe corn would run. He started drafting a response email accepting the $356. Then something stopped him. Marcus had always kept his lease documents in a metal filing cabinet in the corner of his home office. Old habit. Paper files, even for things that existed digitally. He'd been going through the folder for another reason, looking for an old soil test, when he pulled out the original 2006 lease. Not the most recent version, the original. The one signed by the first owner, a man named Harold Voss, who'd been farming the property himself before he got too old to keep up and had shifted to cash renting it out. Marcus had never read the full 2006 document carefully. Why would he? It was 20 years old. He'd signed updated leases since then, and the boilerplate never changed much. He was about to set it aside when a heading partway down page 4 caught his eye. He read it once, read it again. Section 7C. Master Agricultural Lease Revision, Escalation Structure. The clause was written in plain but precise language. It established that any rental escalation exceeding 15% of the base rate in any 5-year period would be subject to the escalation structure outlined in the original agreement, which capped annual escalation at 3% compounded unless the tenant consented in writing. More important was what came next. This provision survives any transfer of ownership and runs with the land. Marcus read that phrase 3 times. Runs with the land. He pulled out his phone and called his attorney. The attorney's name was Dale Pruitt, and he handled agricultural contracts for farms across the county. Marcus read him the clause over the phone. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Pull everything you have on that original lease and bring it to my office tomorrow morning." Dale's explanation the next day was methodical. In property law, a covenant or provision that runs with the land means it's attached to the property itself, not to any particular owner. When Harold Voss sold the land, he transferred the deed. But deed transfers carry with them any obligations or covenants recorded against the property or embedded in binding agreements that were structured to survive ownership changes. The 2006 lease had been drafted with specific language to do exactly that. Whoever owned the land was bound by the escalation structure Harold had agreed to. Ownership changed. The paper stayed. Marcus stared at the original lease on Dale's desk. "Is this enforceable?" Dale tapped the clause with his pen. "It's not a standard provision. Whoever drafted this in 2006 knew what they were doing. The language is clear. Whether the new company's legal team knew it existed when they acquired the portfolio is a different question." He paused. "But yes, on its face, this is enforceable." Marcus asked what he needed to do. Dale told him to hold on responding to the company's latest offer and let him send a formal letter first. The letter Dale sent was not aggressive. It was not accusatory. It cited the clause by section, quoted the relevant language, referenced the principle of running covenants in property law for the jurisdiction, and noted that the proposed increase of 40%, or even 25%, appeared to be in conflict with the existing agreement. It requested that the company review the original lease documentation and respond within 30 days. The response came back in 12. It was from the company's in-house legal team. The tone had changed. Less portfolio manager, more attorney. They challenged the applicability of the clause, arguing that the updated leases signed in subsequent years had superseded the original 2006 agreement. They said their acquisition due diligence had not surfaced the provision and that they had operated in good faith on current market pricing. Dale reviewed their response and sent back a two-page reply. The key argument: the updated leases had explicitly incorporated the original lease terms by reference, standard boilerplate, and contained no language specifically voiding or superseding Section 7C. The escalation cap had not been waived, it had been carried forward. The legal memo cited 3 relevant cases from the state's agricultural property case history. It was not a bluff. It was procedural and grounded. Another 19 days passed. Marcus farmed every acre of information he had access to in the meantime. He ran scenarios. He talked to Rita again. He walked through the equipment shed twice, looking at the planter. He thought about what selling it actually solved. He thought about the 25% offer and whether he should just take it and move on. He thought about leverage, about how his growth 5 years ago had put that equipment note on his books, and how a rising rent had turned a manageable payment into a structural risk. Fixed costs don't shrink when margins do. That was the lesson sitting in front of him in bold. Leverage works until it doesn't. He did not list the planter. The company's second response arrived on a Friday afternoon. Their legal team had reviewed the complete documentation package, including the original 2006 lease and all subsequent renewals. They acknowledged that Section 7C had not been explicitly superseded. They did not admit error. Their language was careful. What they offered was this: a revised rental proposal of $294 per acre, a 2% increase from $285, consistent with the compounded cap outlined in the original escalation structure. It wasn't a win. It was a procedural outcome. The clause had held. Marcus ran the DSCR calculation with $294 per acre. Annual rent, $323,400. Annual increase from current $9,900. His operating margins returned to positive territory. The DSCR came in at 119, above the bank threshold. He called his banker and walked through the updated numbers. The operating line renewed. He called Dale and thanked him. Dale told him to make a copy of that 2006 lease and store it somewhere he'd never lose it. Marcus drove out to his equipment shed that evening. He backed the 12-row planter out into the late afternoon light. He walked around it, checked the row units, looked at the monitors in the cab. 2 more annual payments and it was his, free and clear. It was a good piece of equipment, not heroic, not lucky, just a machine that did its job when the conditions let it. He thought the planter was the problem. It wasn't. The problem was a fixed cost structure that had become vulnerable to a rent increase he didn't see coming. The planter was a symptom. The clause was the answer. And the clause had been sitting in a filing cabinet for 17 years, waiting to be read. He backed the planter into the shed and closed the door. Here's what this story actually teaches, because there are several things going on at once. The DSCR lesson first. Debt service coverage ratio exists because lenders need to know you can pay your bills before they give you access to more credit. When your fixed costs rise, rent, equipment notes, loan payments, and your income stays flat or shrinks, the ratio deteriorates. Your operating line becomes harder to renew. Once that happens, you can't fund inputs. Once you can't fund inputs, the operation stops. It doesn't take a catastrophic year. It just takes one large fixed cost moving in the wrong direction. The equipment note lesson. Marcus's planter payment wasn't a problem when he signed it. At $285 rent and average corn prices, the math worked. The problem wasn't the payment itself. The problem was that his entire cost structure had been built on the assumption that his cash rent was stable. When the rent moved 40%, every other fixed cost on the ledger became proportionally more dangerous. That $82,000 payment didn't change in dollars, but it changed in context. Fixed costs don't move. The margin they come out of does. The lease lesson. Cash rent structures are simple on the surface. Farmer pays landowner a set rate per acre per year. No participation, no crop share, no weather adjustment. Simple. But simple doesn't mean flexible. When you're farming hundreds or thousands of rented acres, your entire operating structure is built on the assumption that those rates are stable. One large ownership transfer, one portfolio revaluation, and the ground shifts under you. The only protection is paper. Specifically, paper that was written correctly and stored carefully. Paper agreements last longer than ownership. That's the sentence this whole story is built on. Harold Voss sold his land, his lease stayed. The company that bought it didn't know about Section 7C, but ignorance of a recorded obligation doesn't void the obligation. Ownership changes. Paper stays. Would you have signed the 40% increase to avoid losing the ground? A lot of farmers would. The pressure to keep acreage is real. The fear of losing production history and relationships built over a decade is real. Signing feels like survival. But sometimes survival math has to override survival instinct. Would you have sold the planter? It felt like the right move. It felt like action. Cut the fixed cost, buy some time, figure out the rest later. But it was the wrong move. It addressed the symptom while the actual problem, an unenforceable rent increase, was still in a filing cabinet waiting to be found. Would you have read the lease again? That's the question. Marcus almost didn't. He pulled it out looking for a soil test. He was about to set it aside. A different version of Tuesday, and that clause stays buried. The company gets its increase. Marcus signs the 25% offer just to survive. The planter gets listed in the spring. And a covenant that a careful attorney wrote into a document in 2006 expires unused because the person it protected never read it. The 12-row planter is still in that shed, not because it won anything, not because it was special or irreplaceable, because the cash flow stabilized, because the rent held, because a clause written 17 years ago by someone Marcus never met turned out to be the most important document in his operation. The planter survived because the numbers came back into range. That's how this works. It's not dramatic, it's procedural. It's math and paper and patience and reading every line of every document in your filing cabinet before you make a decision that costs you $125,000 a year. Ownership changes. Paper stays. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Drop a comment below. What would you have done? Would you have signed the increase, sold the planter, or gone back to the original lease? And if you've ever found something buried in old paperwork that changed a financial outcome, share it. Those stories deserve to be told. 40% overnight, the planter never left.